Welcome to African Folktales by Tammy. Please don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe for more interesting stories. Also share this story to someone who might be interested. Let's get into the story. Timothy Charles gazed out of his office window, admiring the city skyline. Life had rewarded him for his hard work and resilience. His business empire, Charles Enterprises, had grown from a modest startup to a leading player in the real estate and oil sectors. The road to success had been anything but easy, but Timothy's strong network of friends and mentors had helped him push through. Above all, there was one person he credited more than anyone else: his best friend, Henry Evans. Henry had been by Timothy's side for years, from their college days when they both struggled to make ends meet. Timothy often reminisced about their late-night brainstorming sessions in the campus library, dreaming of a future filled with success. Even when times were tough, Henry always seemed to have Timothy's back. It was Henry who had helped Timothy secure his first major deal, introducing him to influential clients and offering strategic advice whenever things got rough. Timothy valued loyalty above all else, and to him, Henry embodied that quality. Now, as Timothy prepared to take another step in his personal life by marrying his fiancée Vivian Grace, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. Vivian was everything he had ever wanted in a partner: supportive, compassionate, and intelligent. Their wedding was only a few months away, and the couple was busy finalizing arrangements. Vivian was particularly excited about the guest list and had been working closely with Henry to plan a surprise event for Timothy's birthday. "I swear you two are plotting something behind my back," Timothy had joked the previous weekend when he caught them whispering. "Don't worry about it, Tim," Henry replied with a grin. "We've got you covered." Vivian laughed and placed a reassuring hand on Timothy's shoulder. "You'll love it, trust me. Just let us handle the details." Timothy had no reason to doubt either of them. His life was going exactly as planned. However, that perfect image would soon begin to crack. A few weeks later, Timothy noticed some troubling signs in his business operations. An important merger negotiation had collapsed unexpectedly, and a key investor had pulled out without explanation. At first, Timothy attributed it to bad luck or poor timing. He called his executives into a meeting and demanded answers, but they had none. Everything seemed to be running smoothly, on paper at least. "Maybe it's just a rough patch," Henry suggested when Timothy confided in him. They were having drinks at a high-end bar after a long day of meetings. "Every business goes through this. You've been winning for so long that you're bound to hit a few bumps." "You're probably right," Timothy said, though he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. "Still, it's strange how everything's happening all at once. Deals don't just fall apart like that for no reason." Henry nodded thoughtfully. "If it'll give you peace of mind, why not do a full audit? Maybe someone on your team is messing up the details." Timothy agreed and took Henry's advice, ordering a comprehensive review of his company's operations. Yet the audit came back clean. There were no signs of internal errors or leaks. Still, the setbacks kept piling up. Timothy became increasingly restless, spending more late nights in the office and poring over contracts, trying to find patterns in the chaos. Vivian noticed the toll it was taking on him. "You're working too hard, Tim," she said one night after he returned home late. "You need to rest. The wedding is coming up, and I don't want you burned out before the big day." "I know," Timothy replied, forcing a smile. "I'll try to take it easy. I just can't shake the feeling that something isn't right. But I'll figure it out." "Of course you will. You always do," Vivian said, giving him a kiss on the cheek. Despite her encouragement, Timothy remained on edge. His instincts told him that someone was working against him, but he couldn't pinpoint who or why. He trusted Henry and Vivian implicitly, which left him with few suspects. He was determined to get to the bottom of it, unaware that the answers he sought would soon shake the very foundations of his trust. For now, however, Timothy tried to focus on the positives. He still had time to turn things around. After all, Henry was always there to offer advice and support, just as he always had been. But Timothy had no idea that the very friend he relied on was quietly orchestrating his downfall, watching from the shadows as his empire began to crumble. Timothy arrived at his office early one Monday morning, feeling an overwhelming need to take control of the situation. He was greeted by his assistant, Grace, who handed him a folder with updates on various ongoing projects. The news wasn't good. 2 more investors had backed out of a housing project in the city of Richmond Heights, and a critical land acquisition had fallen through due to sudden legal complications. Grace's concerned expression mirrored Timothy's growing frustration. "Is there any explanation for this?" Timothy asked, flipping through the documents. "Not yet, sir. The legal team is still investigating, but it's odd. The landowners were on board, then out of nowhere, they withdrew." "It's like someone else got to them," Grace replied. "Find out everything you can. I don't care how much it costs, just get me answers," Timothy said firmly. Grace nodded and left to carry out his orders. Timothy sank into his chair, his mind racing. These setbacks were happening too frequently to be coincidental. Over the next few days, things only got worse. His competitors were mysteriously gaining access to classified information about his deals, making preemptive bids on key contracts. The losses were stacking up, and the board of directors was becoming restless. During a tense board meeting, one of the senior directors, Mr. Rowland, voiced what others were likely thinking. "Timothy, we respect your leadership, but the board needs reassurances. We've seen a 15% drop in projected revenue within 2 months. Our investors need confidence. What's the plan?" "I'm aware of the situation and I'm already taking steps to address it," Timothy replied, trying to maintain his composure. "We'll be fine." "Forgive me, but 'we'll be fine' isn't going to cut it," another director, Mrs. Dawson, chimed in. "Perhaps we need to bring in outside advisors." The suggestion stung. Timothy had built the company from nothing. The thought of outsiders stepping in to fix his business was infuriating. Still, he managed a diplomatic response. "I appreciate your concerns, but I need a little more time. Let's reconvene in 2 weeks. By then, I'll have a solid strategy in place." After the meeting, Timothy called Henry for support. They met later that evening at their usual spot, a quiet lounge overlooking the harbor. Timothy vented about the board's growing distrust and the endless string of bad deals. "They're panicking," Timothy said, rubbing his temples. "I'm starting to think they're right. Maybe I do need fresh eyes on this." "Nonsense," Henry replied, leaning back in his seat. "You built Char's Enterprises. You don't need some consultant swooping in to tell you how to run your business. This is just a rough patch. You've gotten through worse." "Maybe," Timothy muttered, but the doubt in his voice was evident. "It's just, I can't help but feel like someone's targeting me. Competitors are moving too fast, almost as if they know my next moves before I do." Henry chuckled, though it sounded forced. "You're being paranoid, Tim. That's what happens when stress piles up. Take a break. Let Vivian drag you to one of those wedding appointments she keeps talking about. You need to clear your head." "I can't afford to relax right now," Timothy said with a sigh. "Not until I figure out what's really going on." As much as he appreciated Henry's advice, Timothy couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play. His instincts, sharpened by years in business, told him there were invisible hands working against him. But who and why? The following day, Grace reported another alarming development. The firm they had partnered with on a major development project had suddenly withdrawn, citing unforeseen circumstances. "This is getting ridiculous," Timothy fumed. "We're bleeding out, Grace. Every day is something new. How many more partnerships can we lose before this becomes irreversible?" "I don't know, sir, but I've noticed a pattern," Grace said hesitantly. "All the deals that have failed seem to involve the same people, directors or partners Henry Evans introduced to the company." Timothy froze. "Henry? No, that didn't make sense. Henry was his closest friend." Still, the coincidence gnawed at him. Could there be a connection? He pushed the thought aside, unwilling to entertain the idea. Henry had always been loyal, hadn't he? "Keep tracking everything," Timothy finally said, his voice low. "I need to know exactly who's been involved in each failed deal." Grace nodded and left, leaving Timothy alone with his thoughts. For the first time, a sliver of doubt about Henry crept into his mind. Could his best friend be hiding something from him? No, there had to be another explanation. Still, Timothy couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. Something was terribly wrong, and time was running out to uncover the truth. The tension in Timothy's office had become suffocating. Day after day, more projects crumbled under mysterious circumstances. No matter how hard he worked, it seemed like an invisible hand was undoing his efforts. Timothy struggled to maintain a facade of control, but beneath the surface, anxiety gnawed at him. His mind circled back to the same question. Who was sabotaging him? Late one evening, as Timothy reviewed contracts in his study, Grace called with urgent news. "Sir, you won't believe what I found," she began. "I spoke with a lawyer involved in the Richmond Heights project. He hinted that someone had paid off key stakeholders to back out of the deal." Timothy sat up straighter. "Paid off? Do we know who?" "No, not yet," Grace said cautiously. "But he did mention that the person knew things only an insider could have shared. Our deadlines, budget proposals, even the terms we were willing to negotiate." Timothy clenched his jaw. The implication was clear. Someone on his team was leaking information. "Keep digging. I need names and proof," he instructed. As he ended the call, Timothy felt a cold wave of suspicion creep over him. Could one of his trusted associates really be betraying him? He refused to entertain the idea that it might be Henry. They had been through too much together for something like that to be possible, or so he thought. The following day, Timothy received a call from one of his business partners, Charles Harrington, who had recently cut ties with him. The conversation confirmed Timothy's worst fears. "Tim, I want to give you a heads up," Charles said. "I can't say much, but someone approached me with information about your company's vulnerabilities. They painted a picture that made working with you look like a huge risk." "Someone who?" Timothy demanded, his voice tight with frustration. "I honestly don't know," Charles admitted. "But from the way they talked, it sounded like they had access to your internal strategies." Timothy's mind raced. There was no denying it anymore. This wasn't just bad luck. It was calculated sabotage, but by whom? Later that day, Timothy met with Henry to discuss the ongoing issues. As usual, Henry played the role of the supportive friend, offering reassurance. "You're overthinking this, Tim," Henry said as they sat in a private booth at their favorite lounge. "Competitors are ruthless. They'll do anything to weaken your position. Maybe you're just the latest target." "Maybe," Timothy muttered, though he didn't believe it. "But this feels different. Whoever's behind this knows too much, things no outsider could easily access." "Then tighten security," Henry suggested with a smile. "Run background checks out your team. You'll find a mole." Timothy studied his friend's face carefully, searching for any sign of deception. Henry appeared calm, as if he had nothing to hide. But Timothy's instincts wouldn't let him fully trust those reassurances. He nodded and changed the subject, unwilling to reveal his growing doubts just yet. 2 days later, the investigator Timothy had hired, Richard Mason, delivered an initial report. While there was no direct evidence, the pattern was undeniable. Many of the failed deals had connections to people Henry had introduced to the company. "I'm not saying your friend is guilty," Richard cautioned, "but his name keeps coming up in the background of these deals. It's worth investigating further." Timothy felt a pang of betrayal, but still clung to hope that there was another explanation. He instructed Richard to continue digging discreetly, determined to uncover the truth without alerting Henry. Meanwhile, the strain in Timothy's relationships deepened. Vivian noticed his growing paranoia and confronted him one evening. "You've been distant lately," she said gently. "Is it the business problems?" "It's more than that," Timothy admitted. "I feel like someone I trust is working against me, but I can't prove it yet." "Someone you trust?" Vivian echoed, surprised. "You don't think it's Henry, do you?" Timothy hesitated before shaking his head. "I don't want to believe that, but I can't ignore the signs." Vivian placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Whatever's going on, you'll figure it out. Just don't shut yourself off from the people who care about you." Her words lingered in Timothy's mind long after she left the room. For years, he had built his life and business around trust. Now that trust was unraveling, and he was left wondering how deep the betrayal went. Timothy vowed that when the truth came out, he would be ready for whoever was responsible, even if it meant confronting the people closest to him. Timothy's patience was wearing thin. The more time passed, the more the walls seemed to close in on him. Grace had continued her investigations, providing regular updates on potential connections between their business failures and internal sabotage. Yet no solid evidence pointed directly to anyone. Meanwhile, Timothy struggled to suppress the growing paranoia clouding his mind. He no longer trusted the people around him, even those he had once called family. One evening, Timothy attended a charity gala with Vivian. Despite the elegant atmosphere, his thoughts were far from the festivities. The event, filled with powerful business figures and social elites, should have been an opportunity to network and mend strained relationships with partners. Instead, Timothy felt like a man under siege, watching everyone with suspicion. "Tim, you're too tense," Vivian whispered, looping her arm through his as they walked through the crowded hall. "People can tell something's bothering you. Relax." "I'll try," he said, distractedly scanning the room for familiar faces. He caught sight of Henry across the room, laughing with several executives. Timothy narrowed his eyes. Henry looked far too comfortable for someone whose friend's empire was on the brink of collapse. A nagging thought crept into his mind. What if Henry was benefiting from all of this? His train of thought was interrupted by a tap on his shoulder. It was Charles Harrington, the same business partner who had hinted at insider sabotage earlier. "Timothy," Charles greeted him warmly, though his expression was guarded. "Can we talk privately for a moment?" They stepped into a quieter section of the venue. Charles glanced around nervously before speaking. "I didn't want to say too much the other day, but I heard something you should know. The word around town is that someone in your circle has been feeding intel to rival companies. And it's not just business. They're also targeting you personally." "Personally?" Timothy asked, his voice low and dangerous. Charles nodded. "Rumors about your engagement with Vivian. People are saying you might be losing her." Timothy's heart dropped. "What are you talking about?" Charles hesitated but eventually spoke. "Tim, I don't mean to interfere in your personal life, but I overheard a conversation something about Henry and Vivian. Look, I can't verify it, but if I were you, I'd keep an eye on both of them." Timothy's mind raced, replaying moments he had previously dismissed as harmless. The secretive glances between Henry and Vivian, the whispered conversations, the late-night messages she claimed were work-related. He clenched his fists, forcing himself to stay composed. "Thanks for the heads up, Charles," he finally said. "I'll handle it." As Charles walked away, Timothy stood frozen, his thoughts spiraling. Could the betrayal run deeper than he had imagined? The following day, Timothy's investigator, Richard, contacted him with additional findings. "I've found something interesting," Richard said over the phone. "There are financial records showing discrete payments made to a shell company. The account is linked to someone you know." "Who?" Timothy demanded. "Henry Evans," Richard replied bluntly. "The transactions coincide with the timing of several failed deals. It's not definitive proof of sabotage, but it's highly suspicious." Timothy felt his stomach churn. It was as if everything was falling into place, horribly and painfully. He had held on to hope that Henry wasn't involved, but the evidence was becoming impossible to ignore. Still, he needed more than circumstantial proof before confronting his best friend. "Keep digging," Timothy ordered. "I want every detail, dates, amounts, and anyone Henry's been in contact with." Later that evening, Timothy arrived home to find Vivian waiting for him. She had prepared dinner and seemed eager to spend time with him, but he couldn't shake the storm of suspicion swirling inside him. "You're home early," Vivian said with a smile, setting the table. "That's a rare sight these days." "I needed a break," Timothy replied curtly. He watched her carefully as she moved around the kitchen. She looked relaxed, unaware of the growing tension between them. He wondered how much she knew about the situation, or if she was truly involved with Henry. Over dinner, Timothy tried to probe without raising suspicion. "Henry mentioned you two were working on a surprise for me. You've been spending a lot of time together lately." Vivian hesitated for a fraction of a second before answering. "Yes, but it's all for the wedding. You know how important it is to me that everything goes smoothly." And nothing else? Timothy pressed, keeping his tone neutral. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Tim, what's this about? Are you suggesting something? Just curious, he said, forcing a smile. You've both been so secretive, I figured I should ask. Vivian sighed and shook her head. You're overthinking again. Maybe all this business stress is getting to you. He let the conversation drop but remained on high alert. Something wasn't adding up, and he was determined to uncover the truth, no matter how painful it might be. He was done trusting blindly. From this moment on, Timothy would play the same game his enemies were playing, only smarter. The days of innocence and loyalty were over. Timothy sat quietly in his office, staring blankly at his computer screen. His mind was clouded with a relentless flood of questions and suspicions. Each new discovery felt like another crack in the foundation of his life. He knew he couldn't delay any longer. The time had come to face the reality he had been avoiding. The truth was close, he could feel it. Now he needed to pull the final threads to confirm what his instincts already suspected. Grace entered the office, a look of hesitation on her face. Sir Richard has requested an urgent meeting. He said he found critical information you need to see right away. Good, Timothy said, his voice cold and measured. Set it up. I'll meet him in an hour. Grace nodded and left without another word. Timothy leaned back in his chair, exhaling deeply. He wasn't sure he was ready for whatever bombshell Richard was about to drop, but he knew he couldn't afford to wait any longer. Too much was at stake, his business, his reputation, and his verries of trust. Day an hour later, Timothy met Richard in a secluded corner of a private business lounge. Richard arrived with a folder tucked under his arm, his expression serious. Timothy, I think we've reached the point where everything is starting to make sense, Richard began, sliding the folder across the table. Inside, you'll find copies of email exchanges, financial records, and meeting logs. These tie Henry directly to competitors and certain investors who've been undermining your deals. Timothy opened the folder and scanned the documents. His heart sank as he saw Henry's name on several contracts and transactions. Payments had been funneled through multiple channels to keep the trail hidden. But Richard had connected the dots. Worse still, some of the emails included subtle references to Vivian. Wait, Timothy said, narrowing his eyes at one of the emails. What does this mean? There are mentions of Vivian in these messages. Is she involved? Richard hesitated before answering. It's unclear. While I didn't find evidence directly linking her to the sabotage, there are enough mentions to suggest she might at least be aware of what's going on. Timothy clenched his jaw. He had hoped, prayed that Vivian was innocent. But now even that hope was slipping away. Does Henry know you've uncovered this? He asked. No, I've kept a low profile as you requested. He has no idea you're investigating him, Richard assured him. Timothy nodded. Good, I need you to keep it that way. I'll handle the confrontation myself. That evening, Timothy returned home with a quiet resolve. He found Vivian in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She looked up and smiled when she saw him, but Timothy didn't return the gesture. Hey, you're back early again, she said, setting her phone down. Everything okay? No, Timothy replied bluntly. He stood a few feet away from her, arms crossed. We need to talk. And I need you to be honest with me for once. Vivian's smile faded, replaced by a look of confusion and concern. What are you talking about? I know about the meetings, Vivian. I know Henry's been sabotaging my business, and I know you've been spending a lot of time with him. So I'll ask you once, are you part of this? Did you help him? Her eyes widened in shock. What? Tim, how can you even think that? Henry and I. Don't lie to me. Timmy's voice rose, his frustration finally boiling over. I've seen the evidence. He's been working against me, and there are records mentioning you. I need the truth now. Vivian stood, tears welling in her eyes. I swear, Tim, I didn't betray you. Yes, I've been meeting with Henry, but it was about the wedding. He said he wanted to help plan things since you've been so stressed. I had no idea he was doing anything behind your back. Timothy's gaze softened slightly, but he remained cautious. You expect me to believe you knew nothing? Not even a hint? I didn't know, she insisted, her voice trembling. If I did, I would have told you. I thought Henry was your friend. I trusted him just like you did. For a moment, silence hung between them. Timothy wanted to believe her, but trust was no longer something he could give so easily. "I'm going to deal with Henry," he finally said. "If you're telling the truth, you'll stay out of it. If I find out otherwise, there won't be any second chances." Vivian nodded, wiping away tears. "I understand." The next day, Timothy called Henry to his office under the guise of discussing a new business opportunity. Henry arrived with his usual confident demeanor, unaware that his lies were about to come crashing down. "Tim, what's this new venture you wanted to talk about?" Henry asked, taking a seat across from Timothy's desk. Timothy didn't respond immediately. He stared at Henry, studying every detail, the way his friend leaned back casually, the slight smirk on his face. It was as if Henry truly believed he had fooled him. "We'll get to that," Timothy said quietly. "First, I have a question. How long have you been sabotaging me?" Henry froze, the color draining from his face. "What are you talking about?" "You heard me," Timothy said, his voice deadly calm. "I know everything, Henry. The deals, the bribes, the investors you turned against me. I trusted you, and you betrayed me." Henry stammered, struggling to form a response. Timothy leaned forward, his glare cutting through the silence. "You're finished, Henry. This ends today." The confrontation with Henry lingered in Timothy's mind long after it was over. Henry had denied everything at first, attempting to feign innocence. But the evidence Timothy presented had spoken louder than any of Henry's excuses. Eventually, Henry had broken down, admitting to parts of the sabotage, but still trying to paint himself as a victim. "It wasn't personal, Tim," Henry had said, his voice shaky. "I had debts. Opportunities came up and I had to take them. You have no idea how much pressure I was under." Timothy's only response had been a cold, dismissive stare. "You made your choices. Now you'll live with the consequences." Now, as Timothy sat alone in his study, he reflected on the situation with a mix of anger and resolve. Letting Henry walk away unscathed wasn't an option. He needed to ensure that Henry paid for his betrayal, not just financially but also in reputation. The business world had to know the full extent of his treachery. But Timothy also wanted to destroy Henry on his own terms. It was time to set a trap. The following morning, Timothy contacted his legal and financial advisors, instructing them to create a shell investment opportunity under a subsidiary company. The plan was simple: bait Henry into investing heavily in a fraudulent deal. Timothy knew that greed and desperation would blind his former friend, especially if the deal appeared lucrative enough. The project was designed to look like a high-risk, high-reward international real estate venture. Through carefully orchestrated leaks, Timothy ensured that news of the opportunity reached Henry's ears indirectly. The word spread that Charles Enterprises was quietly backing the deal, adding credibility to the scheme. Timothy's next move was to subtly plant the idea in Henry's mind. He arranged a chance meeting with Henry at a golf course where several mutual acquaintances were present. Henry seemed cautious at first, clearly still shaken by their last encounter, but Timothy played it cool, acting as though their rivalry had been put to rest. "I heard you're making moves on a new project," Henry said casually as they walked the course. "Something offshore," Timothy smirked. "Nothing official yet, just some whispers. It's high risk, but the payout could be massive if everything lines up." Henry's interest was piqued, just as Timothy had expected. "Sounds like something worth looking into. You always had a knack for spotting those big opportunities." "I guess we'll see," Timothy replied, keeping his tone nonchalant. "If it works out, it'll be a game changer. But hey, it's not for everyone. Lots of capital involved. I'm still weighing my options." Henry nodded thoughtfully, clearly intrigued. The seed had been planted. Over the next few weeks, Timothy monitored Henry's moves closely. Through intermediaries, Henry began making discreet inquiries about the fake investment. He approached brokers and financial consultants, trying to verify the legitimacy of the deal. Everything was going according to plan. To ensure Henry took the bait, Timothy authorized staged discussions with investors who pretended to be involved in the venture. These actors confirmed its potential and hinted at how profitable it would be. The more Henry heard, the more desperate he became to secure his stake. Vivian noticed a change in Timothy's demeanor during this period. One evening, as they shared a quiet dinner, she asked, "You've been calmer lately. Did something happen with Henry?" "Let's just say I'm handling it," Timothy replied, his voice steady. "He won't be a problem much longer." Vivian tilted her head, curiosity evident in her eyes. "What do you mean?" "Trust me, Viv. It's better if you stay out of it. You'll see soon enough." She nodded reluctantly, sensing that Timothy wasn't ready to share the full details. Though she still carried guilt over her involvement with Henry, she felt relieved to see Timothy regaining control of his life. Finally, the day came when Henry made his move. He contacted Timothy directly, feigning interest in collaborating again. "Look, Tim," Henry began, "I've been thinking about what happened between us. I know I messed up, and I'm not asking for forgiveness, but I want to prove that I can still be an asset. If you're open to it, I'd like to invest in that offshore project you mentioned." Timothy hid his satisfaction behind a neutral expression. "It's risky, Henry. I'm not sure you want to take that kind of gamble." "I'm willing to take the risk," Henry said eagerly. "I need a win right now. Let me in on this, and I'll make sure it's worth your while." "All right," Timothy said after a calculated pause. "I'll send over the details, but I'm warning you, there's no turning back once you commit." "Understood," Henry replied, his tone filled with anticipation. Over the next few days, Henry poured millions into the project. He drained his personal accounts and even took out loans to secure his position. Timothy watched the entire process unfold with a mixture of cold satisfaction and grim determination. He had given Henry every opportunity to walk away, but the man's greed and pride wouldn't let him. When the trap finally snapped shut, Henry would learn just how costly his betrayal had been. Timothy was no longer the man who trusted blindly. He was now the architect of his enemy's downfall. Henry felt an overwhelming sense of triumph as he signed the final agreement for the investment. He had played it perfectly, or so he thought. The whispers about the offshore deal had intensified over the last few weeks, and the promise of immense returns seemed within reach. His financial struggles would finally be behind him, and he would reclaim his reputation. With his funds locked in, Henry began making plans for the future. He envisioned expanding his own business portfolio and possibly even overtaking Timothy in the market. Yet as the days passed, unease crept in. Updates on the project were infrequent, and when they did come, they were vague. His calls to the brokers went unanswered, and meetings with the supposed investors were repeatedly postponed. It wasn't long before rumors began circulating. Several of Henry's contacts hinted that the project might not be as solid as he had believed. Anxiety started to gnaw at him, but he tried to remain optimistic. After all, Timothy wouldn't let an opportunity this significant fail unless something else was going on. By the end of the second week, Henry's concerns escalated. A major news outlet reported inconsistencies with the development licenses tied to the offshore project. The article questioned whether the venture was a scam. Henry's stomach dropped as he read the headlines. He immediately contacted his financial advisor. "Tell me this isn't true," Henry demanded, his voice strained. "I've been trying to reach you," the advisor replied. "There are serious red flags, Henry. We can't verify any of the key players involved in this project. It's like the whole thing was designed to collapse." "That's impossible," Henry shouted. "I saw the documents. I met with the investors. This deal was legitimate, on paper maybe, but someone pulled the strings and now you're exposed. You've invested everything. If this project tanks, you're done." The words echoed in Henry's mind. "If this project tanks, you're done." He ended the call abruptly, panic setting in. He needed to speak to Timothy. Without hesitation, he drove to Timothy's office, barging in unannounced. Timothy, calm and composed, looked up from his desk as Henry stormed in. "What the hell is going on, Tim?" Henry demanded. "This deal is falling apart. You didn't tell me it was this unstable." Timothy leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. "I warned you, Henry. I told you it was high risk. You chose to go all in anyway." "Don't give me that bullshit," Henry spat. "You knew something was off, didn't you?" "You set me up." "Set you up?" Timothy repeated slowly. "Henry, you betrayed me. You sabotaged my business, manipulated my partners, and took advantage of my trust. Did you really think I wouldn't find a way to make you pay?" Henry's face paled. You planned this from the start. Timothy stood, his gaze icy, every step of the way. And now you've sunk every last cent into a project that doesn't exist. You wanted to destroy me, Henry. Congratulations, you just destroyed yourself instead. Henry stumbled out of the office, his mind spinning. Everything he had worked for was gone. The betrayal he thought he had masterfully orchestrated had turned into his own downfall. Within hours, word spread across the business community that Henry Evans had made catastrophic investment errors. His rivals reveled in his humiliation, and his few remaining allies distanced themselves to protect their own interests. Calls for debt repayment came quickly. Henry's accounts were frozen, and creditors began seizing his assets. The lavish lifestyle he had maintained was slipping through his fingers. He tried desperately to salvage what he could, but the damage was irreparable. Days later, Timothy received confirmation that Henry's properties had been foreclosed and his company was on the verge of bankruptcy. The satisfaction Timothy felt was not one of revenge, it was justice. Henry had dug his own grave, and Timothy had simply handed him the shovel. Meanwhile, Vivian noticed Timothy's transformation. His once paranoid demeanor had been replaced with a quiet sense of authority and control. He no longer carried the burden of mistrust as heavily as before. "You did it, didn't you?" Vivian asked him one evening as they sat on the balcony of their home. "Did what?" Timothy replied, feigning innocence. "You know what I'm talking about. Henry's fall. It wasn't an accident." Timothy took a deep breath and met her gaze. "I gave him exactly what he gave me, betrayal disguised as opportunity. The difference is I played the game better." Vivian nodded, understanding that Timothy had done what he felt was necessary. She couldn't deny the justice in it, though a part of her wondered what it had cost him emotionally. "I hope this brings you peace," she said softly. "It will," Timothy replied, "eventually." For now, he focused on rebuilding his empire, stronger than ever. The scars of betrayal would take time to heal, but Timothy knew he had emerged wiser and more resilient. Henry's downfall was a reminder that loyalty was not to be taken for granted, and neither was trust. Vivian paced her room, her mind clouded with guilt and shame. Despite her claims of innocence, she couldn't ignore her part in the series of events that had led to this point. She had allowed herself to be manipulated by Henry, blinded by his charm and promises. She hadn't directly sabotaged Timothy, but by keeping secrets, she had betrayed the man who had trusted her most. She thought back to the many times Henry had subtly pulled her into his web, suggesting business ideas, offering to help with wedding preparations, and making Timothy seem like a man too preoccupied to appreciate her. At the time, she had convinced herself that Henry was simply being helpful. Now she saw it for what it was, manipulation. The fallout from Henry's collapse was swift and brutal. Vivian's social circle was abuzz with gossip about the scandal. People whispered that she might have been involved, that perhaps she had chosen the wrong side. Invitations to events slowed, and old acquaintances avoided her. For someone who had once been admired for her grace and charm, the isolation was agonizing. One evening, Vivian gathered the courage to approach Timothy. She found him on the balcony, gazing at the city lights. His expression was unreadable, but she could sense the emotional wall he had built between them. "Tim," she began hesitantly, "we need to talk." Timothy didn't turn to face her. "What about?" "I want to explain everything," she said, stepping closer. "I know I've hurt you, and I need you to understand that I didn't know the full extent of what Henry was doing. I was foolish, yes, but I never wanted to betray you." Timothy sighed, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "I gave you my trust, Vivian. I gave both of you my trust. And what did I get in return? Lies and secrets. Do you know how that feels?" "I do now," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I've lost almost everything, your trust, my friends, my reputation. I want to make things right." Finally, Timothy turned to face her. His eyes were cold, devoid of the warmth they once held for her. "You can't undo what's been done. You made your choices, Vivian. Now you have to live with the consequences." Her heart sank. She had known this conversation wouldn't be easy, but hearing those words from Timothy shattered her last hope of reconciliation. "I still love you," she said quietly. "I never stopped." Timothy shook his head slowly. "Love isn't just words, Vivian. It's loyalty. It's standing by someone even when things get tough. You failed me when I needed you most. Vivian wiped away a tear and nodded in resignation. I understand. I won't bother you again. Without another word, she turned and walked away, leaving Timothy alone with his thoughts. He watched her disappear into the house, a pang of sadness flickering briefly in his chest, but he quickly pushed it aside. His focus had to remain on rebuilding his life, not on mending broken relationships. The next few weeks were difficult for Vivian. The weight of her regret became heavier with each passing day. She immersed herself in charity work, hoping to find some sense of redemption. Yet, no matter how much good she tried to do, she couldn't escape the whispers and judgment from those around her. At a charity luncheon, an acquaintance approached her with a thinly veiled smirk. "Vivian, darling, how are you holding up? It must be so hard with everything that's happened, especially after Henry's downfall." "I'm doing fine, thank you," Vivian replied stiffly, forcing a polite smile. The woman leaned in conspiratorially. "You know, people are saying you knew about the whole thing, that you were caught between two powerful men." Vivian's jaw tightened. Let them say what they want. They don't know the truth. Of course," the woman said with mock sympathy. "But you know how these things go. People love a scandal." Vivian excused herself from the conversation, her hands trembling with anger. No matter how hard she tried to move on, the shadow of her mistakes followed her everywhere. Meanwhile, Timothy's focus on rebuilding his business paid off. His company recovered from the sabotage, gaining new investors who admired his resilience. The press praised him for overcoming adversity, and his reputation was stronger than ever. But beneath the surface, Timothy remained guarded. The betrayals he had experienced had left deep scars, and he found it difficult to trust anyone fully. One evening, Grace approached him in the office. "Sir, I just wanted to say, I'm proud of how you've handled all of this. It couldn't have been easy." "Thanks, Grace," Timothy said, offering a rare smile. "It's been a rough journey, but I learned a lot, mostly about the people around me." Grace hesitated before speaking again. "Have you thought about giving Vivian another chance? She's been trying to make amends, from what I've heard." Timothy's expression hardened. "People like her and Henry don't get second chances, Grace. They taught me a valuable lesson. Trust is earned, not given. And once it's broken, it's almost impossible to repair." Grace nodded, understanding that Timothy's mind was made up. Though she sympathized with Vivian, she knew that Timothy had every right to protect himself from further hurt. As the days passed, Timothy continued to rise from the ashes of his downfall. His enemies were defeated, and those who had doubted him now stood in awe of his strength. But deep down, he knew that some wounds might never fully heal. The silence of his empty apartment gnawed at Henry as he sat on the floor, surrounded by foreclosure notices and debt collection letters. He hadn't slept in days. The once confident man who had walked into Timothy's office weeks ago was now a broken shell. Every avenue for recovery had been cut off. His business was gone, his assets seized, and his name tarnished beyond repair. The phone on the table buzzed with yet another call from a creditor. Henry ignored it, knowing he had nothing to offer. The world he once thrived in had turned against him. Former allies now refused to take his calls, and those who once admired him only spoke his name in scorn. He had underestimated Timothy. The plan to sabotage him had seemed foolproof, cripple his business from the inside, secure strategic partnerships, and eventually rise to take his place. Yet in his arrogance, Henry had failed to see the trap being set right under his nose. He now understood that Timothy had not just outsmarted him, but had orchestrated his complete financial ruin. Desperate for some form of redemption, Henry reached out to one of his few remaining acquaintances, a wealthy investor named Marcus. The meeting was awkward from the start. Marcus barely acknowledged Henry's presence as he flipped through reports in his luxurious office. "Marcus, I need help," Henry said, trying to maintain a composed demeanor despite his desperation. "I just need an investment partner to bounce back. You know I've made profitable deals in the past." Marcus glanced up, his expression unreadable. "In the past, sure, but now you're toxic, Henry. No one in this industry will touch you. Your reputation is shot, and quite frankly, I don't want your baggage attached to my name." Henry's face fell. I can turn it around. I just need a chance. Marcus sighed and leaned back in his chair. A chance? You had chances, Henry. You burned them when you went after Timothy. People see him as a survivor, someone who came out stronger after being targeted. Meanwhile, you're the villain in this story. No one trusts you anymore. The harsh reality hit Henry like a punch to the gut. He was no longer seen as a businessman, but a cautionary tale of greed and betrayal. With no other options, he left Marcus's office in silence, his mind racing for a solution that didn't exist. Henry's personal life fared no better. The woman he had once flaunted as his new romantic interest after betraying Timothy had left him the moment his fortunes changed. She had packed her bags and walked out without so much as a goodbye, leaving him with nothing but bitter memories. On the streets, Henry overheard whispers as he passed by. People who had once greeted him with admiration now laughed behind his back. "That's Henry Evans," one man muttered to his companion. "Can you believe he thought he could outsmart Timothy Charles? Look at him now." Henry quickened his pace, the words stinging more than he cared to admit. The weight of his failure pressed down on him, suffocating in its intensity. He couldn't escape the consequences of his actions, and every reminder of his downfall chipped away at what little pride he had left. Meanwhile, Timothy remained focused on his own recovery. He had no interest in watching Henry suffer, but knew that the man's fate was sealed. His network of colleagues confirmed what Timothy had suspected: Henry was finished. Every connection he once had was severed, and creditors were preparing legal action to recoup their losses. At one point, Grace brought Timothy a report detailing the latest developments in Henry's financial collapse. She hesitated before handing it over. "Are you sure you want to see this?" "You've already won, sir," Timothy waved her off. "I don't need to gloat, Grace. This isn't about revenge, it's about closure." He skimmed the report, noting how far Henry had fallen. Though a part of him felt vindicated, another part was saddened by how things had ended. They had been friends once, brothers even, but betrayal had poisoned that bond beyond repair. Henry's last attempt to salvage his dignity came in the form of a public statement. He arranged a press conference, hoping to control the narrative and present himself as a victim of circumstance. The room was sparsely filled, with only a handful of reporters in attendance. Cameras flashed as he stepped to the podium, his face gaunt and weary. "Good afternoon," Henry began, his voice lacking its usual confidence. "I want to address the recent events that have affected my business and personal life. Mistakes were made, and I take full responsibility for certain decisions. However, I was also misled by others." "Do you mean Timothy Charles?" one reporter interrupted, her tone sharp. Henry froze, unsure of how to respond. If he admitted to targeting Timothy, it would destroy any remaining credibility he had. But if he deflected the blame, no one would believe him. I don't blame anyone but myself," he finally muttered. The reporters exchanged knowing glances, their skepticism evident. The press conference ended in disaster, with headlines the next day branding Henry as a failed manipulator who had gotten exactly what he deserved. His attempt to reclaim his reputation had backfired spectacularly, further solidifying his status as a pariah. Alone once more, Henry stared out the window of his crumbling apartment. His mind drifted to the past, the days when he and Timothy had dreamed of success together. Somewhere along the way, greed and envy had consumed him, leading him down a path of destruction. Now all he had left were regrets. Timothy stood on the rooftop terrace of his company's new headquarters, the wind tugging at his blazer. The city stretched out before him, a testament to the resilience and determination that had carried him through the darkest period of his life. His empire, once threatened by betrayal, now thrived stronger than ever. The setbacks had forced him to rebuild from the ground up with a sharper focus on loyalty, integrity, and strategy. Every lesson learned from the pain of Henry's betrayal had become a cornerstone for his future success. Investors who had once been hesitant to support him were now eager to align themselves with his growing portfolio. Timothy had handpicked a new executive team, men and women with a proven track record of trustworthiness and innovation. His reputation in the business world was now one of unshakable strength and resilience. As he reflected on how far he had come, Grace approached him with a file in hand. The final contracts for the international development deal have been signed, she informed him. This will push our revenue projections to new heights by the end of the quarter. Good, Timothy replied with a nod. Thank you for your hard work. You've been one of the few constants I could rely on. Grace smiled warmly. It's been an honor, sir. Watching you turn things around has been inspiring, not just for me, but for everyone who believed in you. Timothy appreciated her words but didn't dwell on them. He had learned to move forward without seeking constant validation. The wounds left by betrayal had not fully healed, but they had taught him to rely on his own strength and instincts. Later that evening, Timothy attended a high-profile networking event held in one of the city's most prestigious hotels. The atmosphere buzzed with energy as CEOs, investors, and political figures mingled. Many of them now sought Timothy's attention, eager to gain insights from the man who had survived a coordinated attack on his business and reputation. Timothy, it's great to see you, an older executive, Mr. Caldwell, greeted him with a handshake. You've set a new standard for how to handle adversity. Everyone's talking about your comeback. I appreciate that, Timothy responded with a polite smile. But I've learned it's not just about bouncing back. It's about who you surround yourself with and making sure you're prepared for anything. Well, you certainly seem prepared for the future, Caldwell replied. If you ever want to collaborate on new ventures, you know where to find me. Timothy nodded and continued making his rounds, but he remained guarded. While he had regained his footing in the business world, he no longer took offers of friendship or partnership at face value. He had come to understand that trust was a rare and fragile commodity. Vivian, meanwhile, had stayed out of the spotlight. She had chosen to rebuild her life quietly, knowing that her relationship with Timothy was beyond repair. However, she couldn't resist attending the networking event, hoping for one final opportunity to speak with him. She found him near the bar, engaged in conversation with a group of executives. He looked confident, at ease in a way she hadn't seen in months. Gathering her courage, she approached him once the others dispersed. "Tim," she said softly. Timothy turned, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw her. "Vivian, I wasn't expecting to see you here. I thought I'd check in." "I heard about your latest success," she replied, fidgeting with the hem of her dress. "You've done amazing things. I just wanted to say congratulations." "Thank you," Timothy said, his tone neutral. "I know you don't owe me anything, but I want you to know that I've been working on myself," Vivian continued. "I've learned from my mistakes. I won't ask for your forgiveness. I just wanted you to know that I truly regret everything." Timothy studied her for a moment, then gave a curt nod. "I appreciate you saying that, but as I told you before, trust doesn't come back easily. We both have to live with the choices we made." Vivian's eyes glistened with unshed tears, but she managed a sad smile. "I understand. I wish you all the best, Tim." She walked away without waiting for a response, leaving Timothy to reflect on how far both of them had come. Despite the bitterness of the past, he no longer felt the overwhelming anger that had once consumed him. He had let go of the need for revenge and closure. He had found peace in his success and his newfound clarity on the people who truly mattered in his life. A week later, Timothy visited his parents' house in the countryside. It was a place he hadn't been to in years, a reminder of his simpler beginnings. His mother greeted him warmly, wrapping him in a tight hug. "Timmy, it's so good to see you," she said, her eyes shining with pride. "We've been hearing so much about you lately. You've really made us proud." "It's been a long journey, Mom," Timothy replied with a smile. "But I needed to come back here, just to reconnect with what's important." They spent the afternoon talking about old memories, sharing laughter over stories of Timothy's early struggles. It was a reminder that, despite the betrayals and setbacks, he still had a core foundation of love and support. His parents had always believed in him, even when the world seemed determined to tear him down. As Timothy stood in the backyard watching the sun dip below the horizon, he felt a profound sense of contentment. The battles he had fought were behind him now. The scars would remain, but they no longer defined him. He was stronger, wiser, and ready for whatever challenges lay ahead. The future was his to shape. We've come to the end of this story. Please subscribe to my channel to support me. Thank you.